From serial killers who broke down in tears on their final day,
I can't help it, I'm scared shitless.
to the ones who look forward to it with a smile.
You motherfuckers keep with my goddamn execution, there's gonna be bloodshed.
These are the final 24 hours of every US serial killer who is now dead.
I deserve the most extreme punishment.
It's January 23rd, 1989, Florida State Prison. At exactly 7:06, the Florida Department of Corrections starts the official 24-hour countdown to execute one of the most notorious serial killers in America.
I think society deserves to be protected from me and from others like me, that's for sure.
Ted Bundy wakes up in a cell. For over a decade, he has managed to delay his execution. His team of lawyers that consists of public defenders such as Paulie Nelson and James Coleman have been filing direct appeals and submitting emergency motions and arguing that he's not mentally stable for years now.
Take care of yourself, young man.
Thank you.
You're a bright young man. You'd have made a good lawyer. I'd love to have you practice in front of me, but you went another way, partner.
He used every single loophole there was, but for the first time, it looks like it's not gonna work out anymore. Ted gets the same cup of prison coffee he gets all the time, while his lawyers work on last-minute appeals. They try everything to delay the execution once again. His constitutional rights were violated during the trial. The evidence was handled incorrectly. All of these arguments are being presented, but one by one, it seems like they're getting denied. After all, Ted confessed to the murders of at least 30 people, almost all of them being young women with long, dark brown hair, and his real body count is believed to be far higher.
Each time I'd harm someone, each time I'd kill someone, there'd be an enormous amount of horror, guilt, remorse afterwards.
His crimes stretched across 7 different states. Ted used to pretend to have an injury. He would use a sling or a crutch and ask them to help him carry something into his car. But when they turned their back, he would then knock them unconscious and drive away. He would assault, torture, and eventually take their lives. And even after their passing, he would often come back for days to assault their bodies.
He decides upon young, attractive women being his victim.
And even after getting caught by the police, he managed to escape twice. And during one of these escapes, he broke into a Florida State University sorority house and strangled 2 women to death while beating 2 others. And less than a month later, he kidnapped and murdered Kimberly Leach, whose body was later found in a pig shed. The US Supreme Court rejects the last appeal by his lawyers. It's final now. There's no way that Ted will be able to delay it another time. These are truly his final hours now.
I deserve certainly the most extreme punishment society has.
17 hours left. He's allowed a final visit with his mother, Louise Bundy. She spent years believing in his innocence, but now the truth is pretty much undeniable.
Our relationship was always very special. We talked a lot together, and his brothers and sisters thought of him as just a top person in their lives, as we all do.
He calls her multiple times from death row, and he would ask her over and over again, "Do you believe I'm a monster?" And he tells her stuff like, "I don't want to die." She also visits him in prison, but their conversation is short. There's no dramatic goodbye, just a quiet last exchange. 15 hours left. Ted meets with his spiritual advisor, Pastor Fred Lawrence. Even though Ted spent most of his life mocking religion and often thought that he was simply too intelligent to believe in anything like fate, in his final hours before his execution, he tries to find any sort of peace by talking to Fred. Nobody knows if it's out of fear, guilt, or just desperation. He gives his final interview, sitting across from psychologist Dr. James Dobson. In the interview, he talks about his problems with adult content. He tells him that this is the addiction that actually led him to his killings. It supposedly desensitized him and fueled his fantasies.
My experience with, I'd say, pornography generally, but with pornography that deals on a violent level with sexuality, is that once you become addicted to it, and I look at this as a kind of addiction, I would keep looking for more potent, more explicit, more graphic kinds of material.
Although he starts off by saying that he takes full responsibility, he quickly shifts his story back towards societal issues. He tries to tell him that his problem is actually a byproduct of a larger cultural problem.
As young boys do, we explored the back roads and sideways and byways of our neighborhood, and oftentimes people would dump the garbage and whatever they were cleaning out of their house, and from time to time we'd come across books of a harder nature than more graphic, you might say, more explicit nature than we would encounter, let's say, in your local grocery store.
Although he took the lives of many, he is truly afraid to experience it himself, which is why he tries one last thing. He tells the investigators more details about his potential victims. He describes where he buried some of his victims' remains, and he tells them about a skull near Washington, in an area that was already tied to some of his known victims. And the FBI agents and local investigators actually rushed to the scene to try to verify his claims. If those were true, they would actually be able to close some of the cases that were never solved or never directly tied to him. And they do actually find bones that seem to match with Ted's description, but his punishment will not be delayed, even though it might solve a couple of more cold cases. The state doesn't change its mind. It's already been a decade. It's time to put an end to all of this.
His eyes looked like he was almost a child, and his mother caught him doing something wrong. It was a combination of just being sorry and knowing that it was the end. It was the end of the line.
He's offered his final meal. He asks for steak, eggs, toast with butter and jelly, and something to drink. But he doesn't eat or drink any of it. He's simply not in the mood. While Ted is actually rotting inside his cell, outside of the prison, a crowd had already been gathering for hours. Hundreds of people have shown up with signs, food, and lawn chairs, waiting for what they see as the moment justice is finally served.
Is this what you expected to find when you come out here? Folks dancing and singing?
Yeah, why not?
Protesters, victims, families are all celebrating in the streets. They're waving signs that say, "Burn Bundy burn, roast in peace." It could be considered a full public event. People are really happy about the fact that a man is about to die. It gets so out of hand that somebody attending even gets arrested for celebrating with fireworks. Ted, on the other hand, can't sleep at all. He starts crying uncontrollably, and once again he talks with Pastor Fred Lawrence. He asks, "Will the electric chair hurt?" Fred tells him no, there will be no pain, but Ted can't be too sure about that. By 6 hours left, he's been offered medication to calm his nerves, but it's unclear if he takes it. He knows that any moment now, the walk to the execution chamber will begin. Ted is woken up and told to shave and get a shower. There's no delay, no call from the governor. This is really happening now. His lawyers and him weren't able to pull off a last-minute miracle. Some legal technicality to get out of this one. 30 minutes left. The guards come for him. Witnesses can tell that he's scared. His hands tremble.
Just hours before, he told James Dobson, a radio show host, he felt great remorse and his crime should be a warning of the dangers of pornography.
1 minute left. He's strapped into the chair. The straps are tightened around his chest, wrists, and ankles, and the electrodes are fixed to his legs, while a sponge is placed on his scalp. 42 people are there to witness. Most of them are journalists, officials, and a few family members of his victims. And when Ted is asked if he has any final words, he looks at his lawyer and pastor and he says,
"I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." That was Ted Bundy's last statement.
The executioner throws the switch. At 7:16 a.m., Ted Bundy is pronounced dead. Once the message gets out, the crowd erupts in celebration. Fireworks go off again and people are smiling and laughing.
Bye, bye, Ted Bundy, goodbye.
The man who sparked fear into the lives of millions is now gone. For this next person, people aren't so sure about whether she's a cold-blooded murderer or a victim of the system.
Let them know. The cops knew who I was. I left prints everywhere, and they covered it up to turn me into a serial killer.
Eileen Wuornos is known as America's first female serial killer, and her childhood was probably among the worst imaginable. She grew up to a father who was a convicted child who also ended his life in prison, while her mother abandoned her when she was just a baby. By her teenage years, she was living on the streets, engaging in escort services to survive, and hitchhiking across the country.
But you had been working as a prostitute for a while before then, hadn't you?
I was doing real good monetarily, yeah. I was making hand over fist of money.
She had no sort of support system whatsoever, and this would go on for quite a while, until in 1989 Richard Mallory picked her up for one of her escorting services, and before he knew it, she shot him with a .22 caliber pistol 22 times. But this wouldn't be her last victim. The following year she would kill 6 other people, often robbing them as well. In 1991, however, the police finally connected all these murders and began tracking her movements. Following this investigation, they also talked to Tyria Moore, Eileen's girlfriend at the time, and she agreed to help them get a confession. She would call her and slowly pressure her to confess by saying that she was scared of being blamed for the murders.
You don't love me anymore, you don't trust me or anything. I mean, you're gonna let me get in trouble for something that I didn't do?
I said I'm not. Listen, quit crying.
I can't help it, I'm scared shitless.
I
know. What if they don't believe me?
Tyra, listen.
What?
I'm not going to go to jail or anything. Listen, if I have to confess, I will.
Okay. Yes. Why now did you do this? Why did you do this?
And after a series of calls, Eileen would finally break. She confessed to killing them, but she claimed that it was out of self-defense. The men tried to assault her while she was working.
I never provoked those guys. I never provoked them. I never showed any provocations whatsoever. It was very nice, very decent, very clean, very ladylike. I didn't even swear in front of my clients. And a lot of my clients, I talked about Jesus and I talked political, both mixed together, and we never argued. So there was no provocation whatsoever. There was no need for them to look for the closest weapon in the vehicle and try to use it on me to rape me. 2 did, 5 tried.
Richard, for example, supposedly drove her to a remote location, tied her up, and beat her. Despite that, however, she was found guilty and sentenced to death 6 times. For almost every single of the men, 1 death sentence was stacked on top.
Eileen Warren has killed 7 people. She deserves to die. Who gives a darn? Let's make some money and forget about her. But that's not the point. I say it's this. The principle is self-defense. But they're saying if there's a number. No. Self-defense is self-defense no matter how many times it is. I don't care if it's 100 times.
But for nearly 12 years, the legal side of the matter was dragged out. It wasn't sure whether or not she had mental problems, and appeals and multiple different trials just take a lot of time. At times, she would also retract her self-defense claim, admitting that the murders were robberies, or she would say that she was simply getting even. But towards the end, she would stick with the story that she simply robbed them and killed them. It wasn't self-defense.
Whatever's beyond, I know it's going to be good because I didn't do anything as wrong as they said. I did the right thing. And I saved a lot of people's butts from getting hurt and killed too.
And 10 years later, it's time for her final punishment. It's October 8th, 2002, and it is Eileen's final day on this earth. 24 hours left. Eileen wakes up early in her death row cell at Florida State Prison. Even though she knows exactly what day it is, her morning routine hasn't changed in the last 20 years. Prison staff bring her a basic breakfast of scrambled eggs, toast, and milk. She eats in silence. Earlier that year, she accused the guards of contaminating her food with dirt and urine. She said they were torturing and tormenting her, trying to push her over the edge. But today, she doesn't complain. She just eats her last meal. She then receives the final word. All attempts to stop her execution have failed. An advocacy group called Florida Support filed a last-minute appeal. Their argument was that Eileen wasn't actually mentally competent and shouldn't be executed. But their appeal is denied, as Eileen expected it to be. Unlike Ted Bundy, for example, Eileen had accepted her fate long ago. She had waived several appeals in the past and requested that the courts stop all legal efforts to delay her execution. She even wrote to the Florida Supreme Court saying,
The United States Supreme Court, I'm telling you, man, you motherfuckers keep with my goddamn execution, there's gonna be bloodshed. I'm sick of this. Get that fucking warrant signed.
16 hours left. Eileen tells the guards that she has no final meal request. Anything under $20 was on the table, but she declined the offer. All she wants is a single cup of black coffee, nothing fancy. She sits down for her final interview. Nick Broomfield sits in front of her, and he's a filmmaker who has been following her case for years now. For his documentary, Eileen, Life and Death of a Serial Killer. She has a bit of small talk with him, talking about ordinary stuff. But this casual tone doesn't last forever. Their conversation suddenly takes a dark turn. She tells Nick about how she was tortured at the prison and how the guards used sonic pressure on her scalp and that they tried to poison her.
I was tortured at BCI. They had the intercom on in the room, and they kept lying that it wasn't on, and they were using sonic pressure on my head since 1997. Every time I started writing something, it went up higher. So I'm thinking that probably had the TV rigged. The TV or the mirror, something was rigged.
Eileen returns to her cell and sits quietly on her bed. There aren't any more visitors, no family and no friends. Even her long-term girlfriend had ceased communication years ago.
Did you feel Tyra was into it for money as well?
Well, now I look at it, yes, definitely. She was using me monetarily. So was my first lover before Tyra. I bought her a pressure cleaning business and everything, and she took off 2 months after I bought it for her.
And now Steve and Arlene as well.
Everybody.
Why do you think?
It must be the economy, man. Everybody seems like they just care about the money. They don't care about me.
The only thing she can do is wait. 10 hours left. Outside the prison, a small crowd gathers. Some are protesters arguing that she was a victim of society and not an actual serial killer, and others are simply there to observe the spectacle that is about to go down. Eileen asks for a towel and a washcloth to clean up. It's one of the only requests she makes all day, and she doesn't cry or scream. She just keeps waiting. It's time. Eileen is let out of her cell and escorted to the death chamber. There's no struggle and no last-minute plea. She just lies down on the gurney. Her arms are strapped up, 2 IVs are placed into her veins, while 32 witnesses watch from behind the glass. When she's asked if she has any last words, she proceeds to deliver one of the strangest final moments in US death row history. She says, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back. Like Independence Day with Jesus. June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back." And with that, the chemicals begin to flow. And 8 minutes later, Eileen Wuornos is officially pronounced dead at the age of 46. In comparison to Eileen, the world had no doubts about this next inmate. He was just a cold-blooded murderer.
Even on his deathbed, he will express his righteous indignation for his own execution.
It's November 10th, 2009, Greensville Correctional Center, Virginia, 7:06 a.m. John Allen Muhammad wakes up in a small concrete cell on death row. This rather normal-looking man is one of the most infamous killers in US history. He's the DC sniper, the man who turned Washington into a live war zone.
Police are keeping us away from the crime scene right now. The shooting actually happened just across 66 from us on 234. And right now we're told that there is a lockdown. Many people are in businesses and restaurants in the area. They are locked inside.
Born with the name John Allen Williams, John was orphaned as a toddler when his single mother died, leaving him to be raised with various relatives depending on who was available. He didn't experience a lot of love, structure, or consistency in his early years. He was more the unwanted luggage that was passed around. And so as a young man, he quickly found order in the US Army, where he served in the Gulf War and became a trained marksman. But when his service ended, all of that stability went out the window again. And John became as unpredictable as his upbringing. Unfortunately, all of his problems led him to ruin his marriage. And it escalated to a point where he ended up kidnapping his own children, fleeing to Antigua, where he attempted to make a new life for himself. Thankfully, the children were returned to the safety of their mother's home after 18 months of negotiations and custody battles. But John didn't even stop after that. In 1999, he focused his attention on a 14-year-old abandoned boy, Lee Boyd Melville. By now, John changed his name to John Allen Muhammad. He converted to Islam, and this new John took the boy in, so to speak, filling his head with his new ideologies, plans to take revenge on America. And Lee was vulnerable and desperate for a father figure, so he was the perfect vessel to absorb all of these ideas.
The man I met was not a monster. This was a guy that we give him called him that. And once he earned my trust, it was pretty much complete.
Together, the pair launched a campaign of terror that spanned for 3 weeks. They used a modified blue 1990 Chevrolet Caprice and cut a hole in the license plate area to create a spot to fire through. They then disassembled the back seat for more room and tinted all of the windows dark. They would then simply wait as people were out shopping, pumping gas, or just going about their day, and shoot them out of nowhere. And before anybody could actually see where the shots came from, they would simply drive away. This unfortunately worked so well that they took the lives of 10 people, random Americans that were just doing their regular daily activities. But 3 weeks after, John was arrested on October 24th, 2002. And for him, the proceedings only took a year to complete, and he was sentenced to death in the state of Virginia. His accomplice Lee was sentenced to life in prison without parole. And now 7 years later, the day has finally come.
What do you think of the fact that this may be over?
Oh, I hope it is. I really do. I really hope for people's peace of mind.
Governor Tim Kaine denies a final request for leniency. The US Supreme Court has already declined to intervene. John is informed that the execution will proceed as planned. He's allowed a brief visit with his son, Lindbergh Williams. John didn't request this meeting. Instead, it was Lindbergh. He's desperate for some kind of answer, why his own father did all of these terrible things. But John simply stares at his son. He barely acknowledges him at all. And after 5 minutes, Lindbergh accepts that there will be no apologies, no explanations, no grand words of love or regret. He later describes it as, "We were both checking each other out. That's my nose, you have my ears." But that was it. 14 hours left. John declines a spiritual advisor. He doesn't want to talk to anybody. He's just silent. Even John's final meal is very simple. He chooses chicken with red sauce and some small cakes. Even the guards are terrified of his silence. He's calm. His punishment doesn't seem to scare him. John meets briefly with his defense attorneys. That is the moment he actually speaks, but only to go over the events that are about to happen. Even his defense attorneys later describe him as composed, unemotional, and as focused as a hawk. He will die with dignity. He knows it's over.
When he was brought in, he looked down at the ground, looked over at the gurney, but he appeared very calm.
2 hours left. The execution chamber is prepared. The straps are checked and the chemicals are brought in, as well as the witnesses. Among them are family members of the victims and more reporters than his chamber has seen in a long time. At 9 p.m. exactly, John is strapped to the chair. The needle is inserted and the procedure begins.
The warden asked him, "Mr. Muhammad, do you have any last words?" He put the tape recorder there, and Muhammad stared stoically at the ceiling, didn't blink, and just let the moment pass. They stepped away.
John's death is basically silent. No drama, no final words. There's no closing statements from his legal team either. And no one claims his body 11 minutes later, when he's pronounced dead. This next woman is known as the death row granny, and there's a very good reason for that.
I'm sorry for the hurt that I've caused. Today, if it were possible, I wish that I could take every bit of hurt on myself.
November 1st, 1984, and the countdown has just begun for the 52-year-old Velma Burfields. In a few hours, she'll become the first woman in US history to be put to death by lethal injection. Velma spends the first 3 hours of the morning readying herself for the day. She takes out her curlers and makes herself presentable for the end. The majority of those 3 hours though are spent reading the scripture. Velma's passionate religious work in the prison is now well known. The inmates, wardens, and even the governor have all attested to her seemingly genuine loyalty to the cause of ministering to those around her. But she isn't as innocent as she seems. Velma was the product of an abusive home, raised under a violent father. And to escape that abuse, she took the only option available for women in her day and age. She got married. This short period would be the happiest of her life. She and her husband would have 2 children and they were deeply in love. But this would all change when Velma underwent an emergency surgery, an operation that caused an extreme shift in personality. Suddenly, the happy mother became short-tempered, prone to deep sparks of depression, and a sudden distaste for all of the things that once gave her joy. And she would later turn to drugs to control her unpredictable mood swings.
The last 10 years was just like that. Years of a drug nightmare. Days of not knowing where you are or what you've done.
But the real shift came when her husband died in a house fire, and Velma was forced to move back into her parents' home with her 2 children. Her father died shortly after the move-in, but that was when Velma decided that her own mother should follow her father to the grave. Arsenic, a lethal poison, was Velma's weapon of choice, and she used it to take the life of her own mother. And this was her first of many. Velma still had to work somehow to keep her children fed, so she stepped into the world of elderly care. But she used that opportunity to make money in a different way. However, 3 of her patients apparently died of the same symptoms: diarrhea, vomiting, and extreme chest and stomach pains. And it wasn't a coincidence. Velma decided to poison her patients too. And she didn't just do that, but she also forged checks in their names, even after their deaths. 14 hours left. Velma is taken down for her last chance to receive visitors, and one of the guards actually hands her flowers. They're from the prisoners who she administered the salvation of Jesus to. For all of her sins, she's earned the love and respect of those around her.
Living in prison every day is a struggle, even at its best. And I know that without him and his strength that has sustained me, I couldn't have made it even thus far.
Many inside the prison, including the warden, are convinced that her religious transformation is proof of her reform. But that still doesn't change the law. Velma is a serial killer who confessed of killing 6 people. She greets an old friend, Pastor Hugh Hoyle. He informs her that her last appeal has been denied, and Velma isn't really surprised. The only thing she says is, "Well, that's what I figured. I'm ready to go." Before she's taken to lunch, she urges the priests who've arrived to go out to minister to the other inmates on death row. They need it more than her now. She's already accepted the fate that stands before her, unlike her lovers who never got the chance to receive last rites. Velma had a second husband who was poisoned too, most likely because some sort of financial payout, and her later fiancé Stuart Taylor was taken out with his arsenic-laced afternoon beer after he discovered that she'd been forging checks in his name. It would actually be Stuart's murder that opened the floodgates, forcing investigators to admit that no less than 5 people died because of Velma's hands. She submitted to all of them, except for the death of her first husband. Most people agree that she set the fire herself, but that his death was an unfortunate accident, and that after the grief of her first husband's death, coupled with her addiction, everything escalated into her becoming a serial killer. It's lunchtime, and Velma receives the same meal as every other prisoner: pea soup, crackers, and a cup of fruit punch. She doesn't eat with the rest of the prisoners though. Instead, she's placed in a room with a table, so she can read her last batch of mail. Most of the letters are from former prisoners, who sent their prayers as well as wishes, thanking the death row granny for showing them the light during their time under her ministry. Churches and protesters against the death penalty have sent their well wishes too. Jimmy and John Barfield have come to say goodbye to their sister. The visit only lasts half an hour though, but that is because she couldn't miss her next visitation. 10 hours left. Her son and daughter, who are now adults, have come to see their mother one last time. Ronnie and Pam Barfield get a full 2 hours with their mother, and Velma has only one last wish. Ronnie, who's now the head of the family, has to take care of Pam. Her children are absolutely heartbroken when they leave. It's so bad that Pam needs to be physically removed from the visitation room because she won't let go of her mother. 8 hours left. Velma is led back to her cell while the execution chamber is sterilized. So far, she's been friendly and composed, but the visit from her siblings and children finally bring her to tears. When she regains control, she makes a final request. She asks for a bottle of Coke, a packet of cheese doodles, 2 Bibles, and a pen. For the next few hours, she writes messages inside the Bibles, one of her family and the other for her friends. Velma's lawyers are waiting for her to give her the news that she's been expecting all day. All of her final appeals have been denied. Richard Burr, the lawyer who's been with Velma since her initial arrest, is the one who insisted on filing the appeals. Velma actually didn't want that, but Richard was determined to let Velma live. For the next hour, they spend their time saying goodbye. 3 hours left and Velma meets with the chaplain. They talk about family, friends, and of course God.
I'm sorry for the hurt that I've caused so many people. Today, if it were possible, I wish that I could take every bit of hurt on myself.
Surprisingly, Velma even talks with the warden and even shares some word with the doctors who are going to administer the lethal chemicals into her veins. This is a situation that has never been seen before in the history of executions. It's almost like Velma is the one comforting them instead of the other way around. 15 minutes left. It's 1:45 in the morning, and Velma makes her final short walk to the chamber. She's compliant and is strapped to the bed as the needles are inserted. While the viewing room is full of family members of Velma's victims, the rest of the prison is mourning for her. Velma's final words are, "I'm sorry for all the hurt that I've caused. And I know that everybody has gone through a lot of pain. All the families connected, and I'm sorry. I want to thank everybody who's been supporting me all these 6 years." Velma closes her eyes, and at 2:15 a.m., she's pronounced dead. This next person was a clown in public and a killer in private.
Tim McCoy, even though he's the last one, he's the first one.
The first of the 33.
And he was buried by me in the crawl space.
At 6:30 in the morning, the killer clown gets up from his bed at the Statesville Correctional Center in Illinois. It's John Wayne Gacy's last day on Earth. His demeanor is a very dramatic shift from the past 16 years behind bars, where every waking moment was spent appealing convictions, demanding that evidence be reviewed, and the constant denial that he's innocent. 14 of those years were spent in solitary confinement, where he passed the time by painting portraits of clowns. Hundreds of them, and that shouldn't be a surprise, considering that he murdered 33 young men and boys. John lived for the attention, and he used every chance he got as an opportunity to show the world how important he was. During the past 14 years, he sat down with authors, reporters, and every psychiatrist that the state allowed. And John really liked to talk about himself.
I've always told people when I got into clown makeup, I regressed into childhood. It was fun being a clown because you could be yourself or just let yourself go and act a fool. You could be slapstick and funny and have a good time. That's why I always enjoyed clowning.
Yet today, he's simply going through the motions. 15 hours left. He finishes a simple breakfast of scrambled eggs, toast, and black coffee and prepares to meet his sister, Karen. Karen has stood by her brother's side all of these years. Not because she believes that he's innocent, but because Karen and her brother had shared a very troubling childhood. Their father was abusive and belittled John every chance he got. And Karen just cannot accept the fact that his brother is a monster. A man that lured young men, most of them just teenagers, into his home, plied them with alcohol, and proceeded to show them magic tricks as a clown. One of those tricks was to convince them to willingly get into handcuffs, so he could show them how to magically remove the cuffs without a key. But when their hands were tied, waiting for the magic trick to start, John would instead pounce on them. He would beat and assault them until they passed away, and he would then bury them in his basement. This would go on for 6 entire years before the police was able to arrest him. He was literally a killer clown. Since prior to his crimes, he used to dress up as a clown and do public performances. Karen isn't going to abandon him now, not after spending her entire life protecting her brother. At 2 in the afternoon, they sit side by side as the priests come in to perform last rites and offer one more chance for a confession. John, however, denies the offer. he'll never admit it. Or at least he won't take full responsibility. John actually claims that he had accomplices who helped him during the assault and murder of these people, or that some of the victims simply died accidentally.
Tim McCoy's name wasn't put on him until 1988, and he was buried by me in the crawl space.
What was the circumstances of that?
He was killed in the house in self-defense.
And who killed him then?
I stabbed him.
But his murder spree wasn't actually the first crime he committed. He'd been arrested and convicted of assaulting a young man long before the murders even began. And both of his wives knew about the taste for young men that he had, as well as the fact that most of the bodies that were found had no clothes on. The final preparations begin. The execution chamber is readied and the viewers arrive to observe the final moments of John's life.
Hey, I got news for you. I killed 33 times. You're only gonna kill me once. Casey outsmarted him again.
And outside of the prison, a real show is starting to begin. Just like Ted Bundy's execution, masses have arrived for the event. Nearly 500 people. Some of them are there to protest against the death penalty, while others arrive to celebrate it. They even laid out 33 symbolic body bags, one for each of John's known victims. And they even hold up posters of their faces and chant for John's death. John says goodbye to his sister one last time, posing for a picture together, one with a wide smile. Karen won't be attending the execution. She cannot bear to see her brother die. He receives his final meal, which is a bucket of KFC, a side of fries, and a pound of fresh strawberries and a dozen fried shrimp. Outside, the crowd is growing with anticipation. The execution viewers are given a final pat down before being led to their seats. In attendance are media representatives, family of the victims, and law enforcement. But no one's actually there for John. It's 11:30 at night, and John is led from his cell down to the short corridor. And right before he enters the chamber, he and his priest get one last opportunity to pray together. At midnight, he's led into the chamber, a guard flanking him from either side and the priest behind them. Without a word and without struggle, John allows himself to be strapped in. And before he dies by lethal injection, John gets one final mercy. Any last words, the executioner asks, and John only replies with, "Kiss my ass." At exactly 12:58 on the 10th of May 1994, Jan Wayne Gacy is declared dead. But this next killer's last day on Earth wasn't decided by the courts. Instead, it was decided by the prison inmates.
I was drinking a lot during that time, and I acted on my fantasies, and that's where everything went wrong.
Jeffrey Dahmer might be the most infamous killer on our list today, yet this murderer didn't receive the death sentence. Jeffrey was convicted for the death of 17 men and boys, each assaulted, murdered, dismembered, and even eaten, and displayed inside his apartment in the span of 13 years. He received multiple life sentences, but was declared insane by the medical professionals and the courts. Besides, Wisconsin, where Jeffrey was tried, doesn't have the death penalty anyways. So how did his final day look like? On November 27th, 1994, Jeffrey gets up at 7 AM, like the rest of the prisoners. He's only a little over 2 years into his lifelong stay at the jail, but he had already adjusted to the strict schedule at the facility. Stepping out of his cell, he's accompanied to the dining hall by an officer, after more than one occasion where a prisoner tried to end Jeffrey's life. He's rarely without an escort anymore. Even with the guards closely behind him though, the prisoners filing into the dining hall sneer and taunt him, openly threatening to end his life the first chance they get. But Jeffrey doesn't register any of their threats. Instead, he sits down and eats his breakfast. But the prisoner seated next to him notices that he's playing with his food. He arranged the bread and eggs on his plate into the shape of a human, and he's pouring ketchup on the figure, replicating the corpses of his victim. And that is unfortunately a normal thing with him. But then again, Jeffrey's been strange since he was a child. Since his teenage years, he's had thoughts about death and gore all the time. And the only way to drown those desires was with alcohol and drugs. He was an addict long before he even finished high school. But no amount of chemical suppression could keep the fantasies from spilling out into the real world. Jeffrey is escorted from the dining hall and given a mop and a bucket. All prisoners are randomly assigned areas to work in, and this just happened to be his slotted time on cleaning duty, alongside inmates Jesse Anderson, who beat his wife to death, and Christopher Scarver, who shot and killed his former employer. The three work in silence. Christopher and Jesse won't dare voice their disgust in Jeffrey in front of the guard, who stands watching, despite the obvious hate coming in from every side. Ever since his arrival, inmates have threatened to take his life for his crimes. There's no way the other prisoners would allow a man to live who lured young, impressionable men into his apartment with the promise of drugs and intimacy. Once they were locked in, they were subjected to deadly beatings, after which Jeffrey continued to mutilate their corpses, sometimes even keeping their skulls and body parts preserved inside his apartment for years.
I don't want to ever see my mother have to go through this again. Never, Jeffrey. Jeffrey, I hate you, mother. I hate you.
Jeffrey goes to the library and attends chapel, as he has on most days since he was baptized a year ago. Most of the prison and the world don't believe that this conversion to Christianity is genuine, but at least Jeffrey remained devout to his actions. He reads his Bible almost every day, but his increasingly odd behavior and his constant comments and jokes about death and the taste of human flesh indicates that the impact of his actions are just too severe to be properly converted. The regular day comes to an end, and Jeffrey is led back to his cell, alongside other inmates that have been separated from the rest of the group due to their mental instability. Nonetheless, Jeffrey decides to read his Bible for the next 2 hours. When the lights go out at 9 o'clock, he lies down and falls asleep. Jeffrey wakes up at 5 that morning, but he has to wait until 7 until he's escorted to breakfast again, where he eats alone. The 3 prisoners are taken to the prison gym, where they're scheduled to mop the floors. Christopher has been carrying a newspaper clipping inside his pocket of Jeffrey's crimes for weeks now. Until now, he's made a point of avoiding the serial killer completely. But today, something very unusual happens. The guard unshackled the men, and once they started cleaning, he actually leaves the room for 20 minutes. Knowing full well that all 3 of them are convicted murderers. Christopher feels something poke his back, and when he turns around, both Jeffrey and Jesse are smirking. One of them poked him with a mop, but he couldn't tell which one it was. He turns back to his work for a minute, but his anger is starting to build. Now after that, Jeffrey Dahmer actually goes into the staff room of the gym. But that is the moment when Christopher decides to snap. He takes a newspaper clipping out of his pocket, lifts a 5-pound bar off the gym equipment, and follows Jeffrey into the room. When Jeffrey turns around, he realizes that he's cornered. Christopher is blocking the door, and he asks him if Jeffrey actually did all of these crimes. And the only thing he can do is try to run for the door. But that is when Christopher decides to hit him. The attack is brutal, and Jeffrey's on the floor in seconds. After Christopher is done, he leaves him on the floor and walks out. And he then actually decides to attack Jesse as well. And that is because back when Jesse was arrested for ending the life of his own wife, he claimed that 2 black men were responsible. And Christopher, who's a black man himself, takes it as a sin that he simply can't forgive. And Jesse is attacked with the same violence that Jeffrey just experienced. When the guard returns, both Jeffrey and Jesse are on the floor, while Christopher is patiently waiting for the scene to be discovered. Both men are rushed to the hospital, critically injured, and Jeffrey actually dies before the ambulance even reaches the hospital. His injuries are too many to count. Jesse would die 2 days later as well. And when asked why Christopher did it, he just said, "God told me to do it. Jeffrey Dahmer needed to pay." This next serial killer was probably one of the oldest ever.
Clarence Ray Allen, in effect, put out a contract on her. They tried to drown her and they wound up strangling her and tossed her in a river. He was convicted of that murder. He didn't do that, but he directed it.
76-year-old Clarence Ray Allen wakes up at 6:30 a.m. in San Quentin State Prison in California. Clarence is severely diabetic, incapable of walking without assistance, and almost completely blind. He's been on death row for 20 years, and today starts exactly the same way it has done for the past 2 decades. A plate of grits, powdered eggs, a biscuit, and a glass of milk. The day is January the 16th, which also happens to be Clarence's 76th birthday. but he doesn't leave his cell all morning. He's too weak to do so anymore. But life wasn't always this way. Clarence was actually a pretty wealthy security firm owner who owned a ranch and a personal plane. He, however, led a double life, where he was a gang leader that specialized in small-scale robberies. And on one such robberies, Clarence's son's girlfriend, a woman named Mary Sue Kitts, snitched on the gang, and Clarence had her killed for it.
He goes into an undistinguished motel down in the Los Angeles area and executed, I think, the Taiwanese immigrant who was 76 and his 63-year-old wife, and he killed them both. He killed their daughter who was there. So he was good for 4 of them.
He was convicted of the crime and sentenced to life in prison. But unfortunately, Clarence didn't decide to stop there. He put his gang, as well as a fellow inmate who just recently had been released, up to the task of killing more people that had testified against him. 3 people died and 2 were critically injured. And when the perpetrators were caught, a list of 8 other names were found on them. Clarence was then sentenced to death for orchestrating the murders at the age of 46. And now, after 20 years of appeals and legal procedures, the day had finally come for Clarence. He's wheeled out of his cell to meet his lawyers. They've been submitting the expected appeals to stall the execution, saying that his age and his multiple medical conditions would just make this a cruel and excessive punishment. He's obviously too weak to pose any threat to anyone, especially in jail. Clarence orchestrated the deaths of 4 people, not to mention that he's suspected to have killed 2 more and attempted to kill 8 others. The courts are tired of the legal games. 9 hours left. Clarence sees the prison-appointed priests and a few members of his families that stayed in touch with him, and they even take a final picture together. Clarence is led to the execution waiting room, while his final meal and the execution chamber are ready. Outside, a group of 300 protesters have gathered. The death penalty has always been debated, so protesters are to be expected. And considering Clarence's age, it does seem cruel. But the protests and chants aren't stopping the preparations from going through. His last meal is wheeled into the chamber. A bucket of KFC, black walnut ice cream, pecan pie, fried bread, and some milk. Clarence finishes all of it and spends the rest of his time alternating between short naps, sitting in silence, and putting on ceremonial items. It's midnight and the time has come. Clarence is wheeled out, and when they arrive at the short hallway, he actually does something that he shouldn't have been capable of doing. He gets up on his feet and makes the final walk on his own. He walks slowly and surely, but it seems like he would definitely be able to carry his own weight without using the wheelchair at all. He even gets up on the medical cot all by himself. Clarence doesn't offer any resistance to the needle that is inserted into his arm. And when offered the opportunity to speak his last words, he replies with, "First of all, I'd like to say how good my final meal was, how much I enjoyed it, and how much I love my family and friends who've stood by me all these years. I'd also like to thank my friends in Europe who wrote to me, my spiritual advisor Richard Williams, and 2 women, Hetty Ripp from Holland and Christine Kaufmann from Italy, who I gave the Indian name Morning Sun. I also want to say goodbye to all the inmates I'm leaving behind on death row. One day we'll be together again. And a special farewell to my neighbor for 20 years, Ward Weaver, and to my family who stood by me in these final moments. I love you more than words can say. And now my last words, Hoka hey, it's a good day to die. I love you all, goodbye." 19 minutes left. At 0:19, the warden calls for the tap to be opened, and the chemical solution flows into his veins, rendering him unconscious. Everything goes silent, no one is talking as they wait. 19 minutes later, the doctor calls the time of death. It's 0:38 AM, January 17th, 2006, and he's now dead. For this next serial killer, his ex-wife was the reason he ended up being executed.
So I gotta ask you, how are you feeling this morning?
How you would expect someone to feel. I mean, they told you tomorrow you're dying.
Oscar Ray Boland Jr. has just gone to bed for the last time. At 9 p.m. it's lights out at Florida State Prison in Rayford. His schedule at the prison hasn't changed in the last 24 years on death row. All he can do now is hope that his more than 2 decades of appeals will by some miracle come back with a different outcome tomorrow. In 1986, he assaulted and murdered Natalie Blanche Hawley, and to cover the crime, he forced his then-wife to help him dispose of evidence by threatening to take away her diabetes medication if she refused. The second murder was just a few months later, and her name was Stephanie Collins. And then in December of 1986, he killed another woman, Terry Lynn Matthews. And again, Oscar bullied someone to help him cover up the crime. This time it was his own brother. But the habit of roping others into his crimes would later become his downfall. And that is because the next year, he and 2 other men were found guilty of the assault and attempted murder of a 20-year-old waitress, earning him 25 to 75 years behind bars. Without Oscar around to instill fear in her, his ex-wife and her new husband called the police to notify them of the murder of Natalie Holly. And soon after, the man who witnessed the murder of Terry Matthews also came forward. It didn't take long for the system to find Oscar guilty, and they decided to sentence him to death after viewing the mountain of witness testimonies against him. Oscar wakes up at 6 a.m. Since being moved to Florida State Prison in 2015, the year before, he's been strictly kept inside a small cell, only being allowed 1 hour outside every day. No recreation, no commissary snacks, and only strictly monitored visits from his legal team and new wife. Rosalie Boland met Oscar while she was working on one of his murder trials. And she and Oscar got married over a telephone call after he was already put on death row. And both of them have argued that Oscar was convicted on the testimony of a wife and brother who had reasons to hate Oscar, and that every decision was based on the words of people who were simply petty. At 8 a.m., Oscar is allowed his final visitations. He prefers to spend the next 3 hours in the company of his wife. He has no other family members or friends who have any interest in saying goodbye. At 7 a.m., a conjugal visit is allowed. But what the couple actually choose to do in those 60 minutes is up for debate. But nonetheless, Rosalie and Oscar say goodbye for the last time. 12 hours left. Oscar's 2 hours of spiritual aid begins. He and the prison's priest spend this time praying, going over scripture and preparing mentally for what is to come. So far, Oscar's been calm and collected. He's been waiting for this moment for 24 years, so he's been mentally prepared for quite some time now. It's 2 p.m. and Oscar sits down for his final meal. In the state of Florida, there are limitations to what inmates can actually have. No alcohol, and the spread must be $40 or less. And so Oscar chooses a ribeye steak prepared medium rare, garlic bread, salad, a baked potato, Coca-Cola, and a lemon pie for dessert. 6 hours left. It's 4 p.m. and Oscar is taken to see someone on the execution team, who walks him through the events that are about to happen. As this meeting takes place, the chamber is sanitized. The witnesses arrive, and Oscar's lawyers scramble to hand in their last-minute appeals, as is to be expected. The witnesses include the family members of all 3 of Oscar's confirmed victims, his lawyers, and a handful of reporters.
Unlike Natalie Holly, who passed away, I will go to my grave knowing I had experienced closure in my daughter's murder.
Florida doesn't allow any family members to witness their relatives' executions, so Mrs. Rosalie Boland will not be seeing her husband again. It's 6 p.m. and Oscar has steeled himself for his death, as it was actually planned to happen at exactly 6 p.m. But 6 o'clock comes around and goes, with no one coming to get him. The last-minute appeals by his lawyers must, by law, be reviewed by a Supreme Court judge. And the judge reviewing the files is being very thorough with his revisions, causing the delay. For 3 hours, Oscar just waits, with only the warden with him in his holding cell, and he will be the one to announce any news if there are any. Not much is said between the two during these 3 hours. 25 minutes left. The warden informs Oscar that all appeals have been denied, and he's finally being led to the execution chamber, where the witnesses are silently waiting, despite the 4-hour delay. Oscar goes without complaint or resistance, calmly allowing the guards to strap him down. He hasn't said a word since entering the room. He doesn't look at the family, he doesn't acknowledge his captors. He just lies down and waits. When the warden asks him if he has any last words, Oscar shakes his head and says, "No, sir." This might actually be the fastest execution that Florida has done in the past 50 years, because at 10:14, 23 minutes after being led from his cell, Oscar stops breathing. He's left untouched for a minute before guards shake him to see if there's any response on the flatline monitors. At 10:16, Oscar Ray Boland is declared dead. His wife Rosalie is the only one present to collect his ashes when they're released a few weeks later. This next killer took the lives of dozens and almost got away with it.
He's said several times that he's going to kill other people. He's threatening to kill me.
It's 6 a.m., February 22nd, 1996, and William is awoken for the day. Just because he's scheduled for death at midnight, it doesn't excuse him for getting up at the same time that everybody else does. Besides, this child killer has a long day ahead of him. William Bonin took the lives of more than 21 teenage boys and left their bodies across freeways in California. He's been officially convicted of assaulting and torturing 14 boys, all between the ages of 12 and 19. But he also admitted to killing 36 or more, not to mention the dozens of living victims that he attacked long before he started killing them. The now so-called freeway killers case was especially complicated, because he didn't always commit the murders alone. Sometimes he had accomplices and the crimes were spread out. The DNA evidence was also always all over the place. And so if it weren't for a lucky break, where a police officer happened to catch him with a terrified teenager in his car, the freeway killer would have gone on killing kids for who knows how long. But now William's locked up, and he eats his bread covered in jelly and drinks a carton of milk before getting himself washed up. William attempts to phone a radio station during his allotted time to call family. This is very unusual for him. In the last 14 years of being on death row, he's never sat down for the scores of authors and reporters that have requested to speak with him. But today is different. It's literally his last day on Earth. Luckily, a guard catches him and stops the call, because it's actually against the law for death row inmates to speak to any media outlets on the day of their execution. It's possible that William wanted to tell the world about his abusive and unpredicted childhood. The three Bonin brothers knew the inside of juvenile detention centers better than they did their own home, so it's no surprise that William's petty crimes turned into assaults by the time he reached his teens, considering how much exposure he had to violence and instability. There was a brief time period, however, where William seemed to thrive in the military, where the enforced structure suited him well, but he was already secretly assaulting fellow soldiers and men in their countries that he was deployed in. And when he returned to the US, his unstable parents always seemed to draw him back into their unhinged lives. And so that escalated into multiple arrests for the torture and assault of young men and boys. William sits down with his legal team for the expected last-minute attempts to call a halt to the execution. They go through the predictable motions: insanity, requests to review evidence, and possible coercion during police interrogations. But William and his lawyers all know that these attempts are all for nothing. The legal system actually gave William more chances than he deserved already. It's all thanks to that leniency that William was let out of prison early on 2 separate occasions, when the courts knew full well that he had assaulted multiple victims and that the mental health professionals considered him an untreatable violent offender. But shortly after his second release, William met arsonist and thief Vernon Butts and mentally challenged Gregory Miley, and together the three of them would then become the freeway killer murders. 10 hours left. William meets his prison chaplain and a handful of friends he's made over the years, and reads his last ever delivery of mail. This time, William's lawyers actually get a win. They manage to get a reporter in to interview the serial killer. The interview was broadcast live on radio, and in it, William makes no excuses and his voice is steady and unemotional. He's known he was going to be executed since the beginning, and the idea of dying doesn't seem to faze him at all. The only regret William has is that he never pursued a professional bowling career. And when asked about what he'd like to say to the families and victims, William simply says that his death will not bring them any peace.
The people that are at the prison, from what I understand, have said that he's good to go, that he's not a threat to society. But I know very different. He's said it over and over again that he's going to kill people.
As far as anyone can tell, William has no remorse for his actions. And he actually says that the part he liked most was torturing his victims. William is led to a room where he's stripped, searched, and told to get dressed again. Then he's taken to the waiting room right next to the execution chamber to await his fate. For the next few hours, the room is readied and the families of the victims arrive to witness the event. Among them is one of the few victims who actually survived the freeway killings. David McVicker is hoping for some closure for the trauma he's endured by watching his attacker breathe his last breath. 5 hours left. William sits down to watch his favorite show, Jeopardy, with his last meal: 2 large pepperoni pizzas, 3 pints of coffee ice cream, and 3 six-packs of Coke. Instead of spending his last hours with family and friends, William keeps company with 2 priests, his lawyer, a state-appointed witness, and the writer for his biography, who's taken last-minute notes. As William is led from his waiting room, he leaves a note behind, and it reads, "I feel the death penalty is no answer for the problems at hand. I feel it sends the wrong message to the people of this country. Young people act as they see other people acting, instead of as people tell them to act. I would advise that when a person has a thought of doing anything serious against the law, that before they did, they should go to a quiet place and think about it seriously." There are no final words of apology and no regrets for his actions, just a vague statement that implies that his death is somehow not justified. It's this attitude and the extremely vile nature of his crimes that explains the angry crowd that's standing outside the prison walls. They've lit candles and have posters of the victims' faces held high, but there's no celebratory vibe in the air, just a burning anger to the many children that lost their lives to William Bonin and his accomplices. At 10 minutes before midnight, William is strapped onto the table and a lethal cocktail of 3 different substances is released into his veins. At 1 minute past midnight, the time of death is called. This next row inmate didn't spend 2 decades to stop the execution like Oscar did. Actually, he fought to die.
I'm not a big serial killer, by the way. Eight people, that's nothing.
Michael Bruce Ross wakes up at 6 AM from the sound of his meal being slid into the small hole in his cell door. He's been waking up this way at Osborne Correctional Institution in Connecticut for the past 18 years. He spends a few hours reading the paper and watching the morning news. Since no guard has come to check on him outside of giving Michael his food and coming by to collect his empty plate, they can only judge what he's doing by the sounds coming from his cell. Michael is known as the Roadside Strangler, and he was convicted for assaulting and murdering at least 8 young women between 1981 and 1984. At 8:15 AM, Michael is taken to the execution waiting cell, where he'll spend most of the day. With him, he brings a Bible, a cup of coffee, a book of biblical verses, and a few pieces of candy. Even outside of prison, nothing in Michael's life has ever been normal. He had suffered abuse from his own parents and other family members as a child, and he actually committed his first assault when he was just 12 years old, and then gradually got up to murder at the age of 21. Michael isn't talking about his crimes now though. He just quietly reads, waiting for his visitors to arrive. For the next hour, Michael says goodbye to the siblings that kept in touch with him throughout the years. They know better than anyone else how damaging their upbringing was. They've never tried to justify Michael's crimes, but they, alongside Michael's defense team, have been fighting for the case that he isn't actually in his right mind. They've been arguing that he belongs in a mental institution instead and not on death row. For 17 years, Michael fought with them, but in the last year, he gave up completely, actively requesting that his execution be brought on quicker. He says that he wants to spare the families of the victims the pain of attending yet another trial, but his siblings and lawyers argue that Michael is suffering from a phenomenon called death row syndrome, where the inmate, after prolonged periods of isolation and stress, suffers from severe mental distress. Michael was definitely not in a good place mentally. He had already tried to end his life on 3 separate occasions, desperate to end the suffering and isolation. 11 hours left. Michael takes a break from talking to his family through a plexiglass window to eat lunch at 3 PM. Normally, this would be the time for a death row inmate to choose his final elaborate meal, but instead, Michael decides to take the standard prison lunch for the day. Today it's turkey, plain mixed vegetables, a slice of white bread, a fruit cup, and an unspecified beverage. Michael really just wants to get over with it, and he's actually been at this stage of his execution before. The official date of his death was set for May 10th, 2 days prior, but the Supreme Court's insistence that Michael's legal team hand in the expected appeals caused them to order a halt to the procedures, just an hour before Michael was set to be executed. And now he has to do it all over again. For the next 10 hours, Michael is taken through the procedure for the second time. The family of the victims, several reporters, and his lawyers file into the viewing room. Michael's lawyers are quiet in their defeat. They fought very hard for a long time, but in the last year, they truly wanted Michael's final wish to die without delay to be granted, and they failed to do that for their client. In their seats, the viewers can smell the cleaning agents used to sterilize the room. The last appeals are being finalized, and the courts are taking their time yet again. Connecticut hasn't executed a prisoner in 25 years, and they don't really want to break their streak now. The question of whether or not Michael is mentally competent is gone through again, but every psychiatrist has confirmed that he is of a sound and logical mind. There's no loophole or technicality left to exploit anymore.
He found that as soon as a girl dumped him, pissed him off, got rid of him, that's when he took his anger out on a victim. Didn't matter who the victim was, it just had to be another girl.
2 hours left. It's thanks to the state of Connecticut's insistence of going through every single detail of this case that the execution time comes and goes. Michael was scheduled to be executed at midnight, but 12 o'clock goes by. The families inside of the viewing room are starting to rumble their anger at another delay, and the crowd of protesters outside start feeling hopeful. It's 2 o'clock in the morning, and Michael is let out of his holding cell. He doesn't say a word as he's led to the chamber, nor does he offer any resistance as he's strapped securely to the bed. Michael simply closes his eyes and waits. The execution team has rehearsed this moment over 100 times. Like mentioned, Connecticut has performed an execution in 25 years, and so they couldn't afford this one to go wrong. The public opinion that the death penalty must be abolished is so intense that any screw-ups will be a PR disaster. At 2:15, the curtain is opened, so that the viewing room can finally witness the roadside strangler's last moments. Michael is asked if he has any last words, to which he replies, "No, thank you." He doesn't open his eyes as the solution starts pumping into his veins. He doesn't look at the viewers, and if it weren't for his monitor going flat, witnesses wouldn't have been able to tell that he was dead. On May the 13th, 2005, at 2:25, Michael Bruce Ross was pronounced dead. He is the last person to be executed in the state of Connecticut and will be the last for the foreseeable future, since Connecticut actually abolished the death penalty in 2012.